I'm really excited to talk to everyone today, and looking forward to. I'll share some opinions, some perspectives, and I know we're going to be breaking towards the end for some additional Q&A. So, as Kelly said, I've been doing product for over 20 years. First 10 years was mostly in digital certificates. Past 10 years has been mostly in payments, mostly in the UK. And then more recently, I joined an Insight portfolio company called doesnt, and we do SaaS software for accounting firms. But when I started doing product management, 20 odd years ago, I came from engineering, moved across, enjoyed the side of technology where you can interact with people, understand markets, things aren't as black and white. Plus, I was a really bad developer. So, and I love tech. I love how tech changes the world we live in. So moved into product management. But initially, I did a lot of work on really complicated product requirement documents, marketing requirement documents, like 30, 40-page documents, templates that needed to be filled in. And then kind of went through the whole Agile revolution of, well, no one's reading the doc, just go sit next to the developer, have a conversation, and start putting some user stories, etc., together. So I've kind of seen it all from really old school waterfall product management to Agile. And at the end of the day, what it comes down to, in my opinion, is how you work closely with your dev team. So I'm going to start off with a slightly controversial statement that hopefully doesn't turn you all off. But I think the way I should have classified this is why Agile does not work by itself. Because Agile is a great way to kind of, take customer input, react, respond, etc., to what's going on in the market. But the problem with a lot of that is if you keep reacting and changing, you never get things done. So what everyone that's ever worked with me always hears me say is two things. If any company, at least a software company, wants to sustain competitive advantage, there's these two key things that I always talk about. As a company, you have to understand your customer needs better than your competitors. Because if you can understand their needs and you can predict what they want, and this doesn't just mean asking them for what they want and giving them what they want, actually understanding their needs, what they actually need from the solution. If you can understand that better than your competitors, you're in a perfect position to deliver what customers need to interact with you on an ongoing basis. The second piece is, how do you make sure that you deliver the features faster than any of your competitors can, or at least fast enough so that your customers can use those features as they need to? If you can do those two things, I firmly believe that you can retain your competitive advantage. Doing those two things is slightly trickier. How do you get your teams to work really quickly, work really fast? There's cultural issues, there's time zone differences, product and tech always on, potentially two different sides. I'm a big fan of believing product and engineering are two sides of the same coin, but it has to be two sides of the same coin because they both bring very different perspectives as to what needs to be done. But if those two teams are aligned, that's really where the magic works. So how do I think the magic actually happens? There's three key areas I focus on in any company that I ever work at. The first one at the top is people. And I don't just mean, good people, talented people, etc. It's how is the organization structured to enable people to do really good work that doesn't have any bottlenecks or barriers in place that stops people from doing good work. Because if the organizational structure causes people to infight, causes people to compete for resources, and they're wasting their time on stuff like that, they're not actually spending their time effectively building products that customers love. So getting the structure is absolutely key. And that's where I want to spend a lot of my time on, which is I think I can say this, I'm allergic to projects. I'm allergic to projects for a few reasons. One, primarily is because no one ever hits the dates. Either you hit the date without half the features, or you completely run over the date and things are way too expensive. Projects just don't work. Now, the other big thing is how you figure out what the right products are that you want to deliver. That's all about getting your customer input, understanding the jobs to be done at the customer. I've got an influence board towards the end of the slides. I'm a huge fan of Clay Christensen and his jobs to be done. If any of you have not seen Clay Christensen, the Perfect Milkshake video, highly, highly recommended. What is the problem that you're trying to solve for the customer? And then as with all of this, It's what processes do you put in place to allow teams to plan on a daily, on a weekly, on a bi-weekly, on a monthly, on a quarterly, on an annual, on a 3-year process. How do you make sure that your teams are all moving in the right direction? If you've got these 3 things sorted out and well-defined, that's typically how product and tech, in my opinion, can deliver efficiently and effectively. So how have I evolved my ways of working and how I've structured product and tech teams over time to be effective? And I'm going to give a few examples. I'm a huge fan of, I'm going to call them value streams. Different people call them different things, but basically what value streams are, it's a group of engineers, a product manager, and a designer. It could be 1 or 2 of those groups. It could be 3 or 4 of those groups, but they've all got a common mission. And I'll get into that in a sec. But if I start on the left, my big problem with projects is time-sensitive resource always drives the wrong behavior. You're either trying to get something done before those resources disappear, which means you're making the wrong trade-offs for the customer. You will never build value for customers if you focus on the short term. People and teams build great value when they focus on building something for the long term. The teams that are closest to the customers are the teams that understand what customers need. And if they've only got resource for a short amount of time, they're not going to optimize for customers. They're going to optimize to deliver on the project. And that's the key thing. You never delight customers by building a single feature. If we could, we'd all be out of jobs. We have to constantly build new features and new products for our customers because the market's evolving. Customer needs are evolving. Technology is evolving. Now, I'm a big fan of Daniel Pink's book on Drive, which says, for people to be happy in their jobs, they need 3 things: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And if you can give your product and dev teams and designers those 3 things, that for me is really where things start getting together and beautiful things start happening. There's a really interesting HBR article called The Power of Hidden Teams. And the example that I want to give you all is they did this analysis. It was actually in a hospital where they looked at 2 different scenarios. The one hospital had a team of nurses and a team of doctors. And what would happen is every day when the nurses came into work, the nurses would be put to work with a different set of doctors depending on their shift. So patients always getting different nurses, doctors always working with different types of nurses, and they kind of measured the effectiveness of the patient care. And then they did something different. Another hospital said, this isn't quite working. What we're going to do is we're going to form squads, doctors, nurses, and physios that are actually focused on a few patients. And what happened in this scenario? The nurses, the doctors, the physios were all much, much happier in their jobs. They all started doing a much better job because they also respected one another's skill set that much better. Whenever we work with diverse teams, those diverse teams are what brings the enrichment and makes us better at the jobs that we do. And this for me is why it's really important that you create value streams. If you've got a value stream, which is comprised of developers and product managers and designers, if that team feels more aligned to their value stream than they do to the dev team and to the product team, that diverse concoction of teams working together, that's what drives the best outcome because there's fewer handoff between siloed functions. The other big thing is because you've got these teams structured together, there's a really long-term view on how those teams work on solving the patient problem in the nurse example or solving for technology problems. And also, because people are focused on a particular area, the quality and the productivity goes up. So now moving to the right-hand side, I'm going to call these things value streams. Now, Scaled Agile does some really interesting work on planning increments, value streams, etc. Depending on the size of the org, Scaled Agile can sometimes be a little bit too bureaucratic, but there's some basic premises around some of this work that is really key, which is if you create value streams that are focused on customer value. Now, depending on the size of your organization, you could have 3 or 4 value streams. When I was previously at a payments company, PaySafe, we actually had 4 different value streams. One focused on consumer, one on merchant, one on APIs, and one on platform. And why I find that really important is once you've created those value streams, the teams have a mission, which gives them their purpose. Once they've got the mission, the other big thing that the teams have got is they've got those teams dedicated for a long period of time, which means if they're in the middle of a sprint or 4 weeks into a sprint and they figure out we're building the wrong feature, we actually need to pivot and change somewhere else, they don't need to get resources approved to go work on that. They're close to the customer. They can pivot in the value stream themselves to get that work done. And the biggest challenge teams typically have is if you need to justify the resources you need for a project, you spend way too much time putting business cases, etc., together. And at the end of the day, it's not about business cases. Your dev product capacity is pretty set in stone. Yes, it can move up and down. It's about the opportunity cost. How do you make sure that your teams are working on the most important thing? So as a CPO, if you can basically delegate how much investment you want to put in different parts of your business, as I said, like in a marketplace, consumer, merchant, platform, and you make those decisions for your product managers, all of a sudden, the product managers and the dev teams know how much capacity they've got, they know how many resources they've got, and they can start running really, really quickly. And then you need to make sure that the tech and the dependencies between the value streams is reduced. That typically is what drives the autonomy in the teams. And that's when you really start getting teams that understand the domain space really well because they're working on it for a long period of time, teams that work really quickly and well together because they understand one another really well, and teams that understand their resources. So the types of processes I put in place is each value stream could be comprised of 1, 2, 3 dev teams. You can have more, fewer, depending on the size of your company. But what I force is every planning increments can be quarterly, they can be every 6 weeks. Each value stream needs to evaluate what is the prioritized backlog that you need to look at, what is above the line or below the line. As product managers, we're all very used to backlogs, but I'm not a fan of a single backlog for an entire organization, because what happens in those situations, how does a product manager trade off a merchant-facing feature versus a customer support improvement versus a platform improvement? But by making those decisions and delegating the benefits down to the value stream level, all of a sudden, all that product manager needs to, that value stream needs to worry about is, what are the things we think we can deliver in the next planning increment? And what's more important is, what is not going to be delivered in the next planning increment? And that's how you set expectations with the rest of the organization around, these are the things we're doing in the next 6 to 12 weeks. These are the things we're not doing. And typically, when you can communicate what you're not doing and what are the things above the line are a priority, the rest of the organization doesn't get scared and they don't want to push the item forward because they don't know when it's actually going to be delivered. So huge fan of value streams. How do you create value streams? Really, really difficult. If you create the wrong value streams and there's too much interaction between the teams, that causes conflicts. Someone once described value streams to me as cutting a piece of wood. If you try cut the piece of wood against the grain, it becomes really choppy, it becomes really difficult, and it's not a clean cut. If, however, you cut the teams along the right value stream, all of a sudden, the teams can work as independently as possible with as few interactions and can get the work done that much quicker and faster. So creating the right value streams takes a huge amount of time and effort from the CPO, the CTO, the exec teams working on that. But once you've defined those value streams, ideally you want to allocate capital, number of resources, etc., on an annual basis so that the teams know how long those go. But within the year, you can absolutely move 1 or 2 developers between those different teams. But as long as the majority of that capacity isn't actually changing over time, that's typically what gives people the confidence to make the long-term decisions and benefits that get the right outcome for customers. The last slide I'm going to mention with you is there's a few things, over time that influence you, that kind of drive the decisions that you make. As I said, scaled agile, some really interesting learnings there. Huge fan of big room planning, where each value stream actually needs to work through where are the interdependencies for the next planning increment. Huge fan of the Shape Up books. Huge fan of version 1 of Marty Kagan's inspired book. Version 2, I thought, was a little bit high level. Huge fan of Clay Christensen and everything he actually writes. specifically it's a 4-minute video on the perfect milkshake, highly recommended. Obviously, the Agile Manifesto is something I look at all the time just to remind me what's going on. Value chain, I'm a huge fan of the strategizer work, where they basically look at this value prop canvas, which is like a 1-pager that talks about the value of the product. But then for those of you that haven't ever used Jeff Payton's user story mapping, for me, it's such a brilliant tool because you basically map out the entire customer journey, and you don't build down in terms of going deep into any part of the customer journey. You basically build horizontally. So you build the entire customer journey and you prioritize the features that you want to release in each of those journeys. And that's where value streams become really important, which is once a team's got ownership over a customer journey, then they just define the increments with which they want to improve that over time. So these are some of the things that inspire me. Hopefully what I've shared today resonates, makes sense. And I think I'm up with my presentation, but happy to take any questions from anyone in the team and help answer anything else.
Well, thank you so much, Spiros. We already have a bunch of questions. But first of all, we ask this to every speaker in our series because this is what we're really interested in knowing from our elite, chief product officers is what differentiates a good chief product officer from the great?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, at the end of the day, it's how do you delight the customers and is the business growing in the right way? And for me, that comes back to how do you create the right culture in the teams? Because no matter how good a CPO is, well, we need to build this feature and it's going to solve the problem, or we need to get really fast at delivery. If you can create that right culture that allows teams to get the customer feedback and deliver products really quickly, for me, that's what makes a great CPO, which is getting the culture right within R&D. Because once your dev and product managers are, a term I learned in the US, cooking with gas, the rest of the organization really comes along because you start getting more predictable in terms of when things are going to be released. The sales and customer support teams stop getting frustrated that it's taking so long and they don't have visibility. So that transparency that comes with speed is typically what I think drives a great CPO, helping a company grow and delight its customers.
Totally. Culture. I mean, if your employees aren't happy, then you're not going to get the outcomes, right?
Absolutely. And if they're fighting for resources all the time, they're not focused on the right thing.
Right. And that leads to the next question. So how should a CPO think about, capacity and resources?
So it's a great question. So the hardest job up front coming into any new company or, setting up a new company is how much capacity do you need and what needs to get delivered? And as I said, not a fan of a single agile roadmap. But for me, though, if you create the right value streams and you typically allocate a certain amount of capacity, a certain amount of resource per each value stream, when you do your planning, you can see how much capacity does each value stream to deliver the stuff that you need. But more importantly, you see how many good things are below the line that you're not actually delivering on because you don't even have capacity. And that for me is the key thing, because once you start getting visibility in what you can't deliver, that helps you as a CPO justify to your investors, to your CEO, to your CFO, there's all this good stuff that we're not doing because we don't have enough capacity. There's multiple things you can do in those situations. You can take resources from another one of the value streams. You can ask for more resources. But additionally, what sometimes happens is once you allocate the work to the different value streams, you'll see that some value streams aren't necessarily delivering as much value as before. They kind of constantly focus on bug fixes and not really driving new creative things. So that transparency into what the teams aren't doing at least gives me the visibility into, well, where are their good ideas and where is the value coming from? And then how do you start putting your bets in? But if you try to do that on a project basis where you've got, 50, 100 things in a big backlog, it's really difficult to allocate resources to that one thing and then reallocate it to another piece. So value streams helps you as a CPO figure out where the investment in the business needs to happen, as well as if you need to kind of bring your costs back down, how you take the cost back down. The analogy for me is sales teams and industries or countries. How many salespeople do you need in a particular industry or a particular country to get the revenue growth that you need? And for me, that's about how you create the right value streams, which is someone that speaks Italian or English is not going to sell in Italy or the UK. So it's having the right skill set, focused on the right thing, and understanding that capacity and being able to justify the return that that investment drives. And the last thing I'll say about value streams is each value stream has an annual cost. Each value stream is delivering features that will deliver revenue and growth over the next 1, 2, 3 years. All of a sudden, you can start defining your ROI at a value stream level as opposed to at a project level. And that just makes the conversation around investment that much simpler and that much easier if you're talking about investment in areas of the business instead of investment across 50 different projects.
Great. And you mentioned that the value stream design does not work well if there are too many dependencies.
Yes.
So how might you go about managing and tracking those?
Yeah, so part of the wood analogy is if you create the right value streams that are focused on a great piece of customer value, typically the customer dependencies are reduced. So it's really key to spend time understanding, like on a marketplace, merchant versus consumer is a really good analogy because there shouldn't be as much dependency across those two areas. Where the problems come is in the technology stack when you're touching the same technology stack or touching the same platform. And what's really important is ideally you have your value streams plan their work independently. But then when you go into the next planning increment, which is, okay, for the next 6 weeks or next 12 weeks, we need to make sure we understand the dependencies so that we can hit our goal. How you track those dependencies is typically what the big room planning does. So you get those value streams together. They talk about all the things they're going to deliver, and they kind of say, oh, for this particular item, I actually need a little bit of the consumer roadmap to kind of expose this feature I'm building into the merchant side. So being able to have those conversations up front so that when you get into the planning increment, everyone knows what their expectations are. If you have value streams that are constantly interacting and having too many dependencies, you have to recreate the value streams because then you don't have that autonomy and independence.
Right.
And over time, you sometimes need to pull the technology stacks apart.
Shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about metrics. So in today's market, the role of the CPO in the context of business is very different than, like, let's say 10 years ago. What KPIs, if any, should the value stream and product org in general be using?
Yeah, I mean, a lot are quite specific to different businesses, but the ones I always get beat up on, as I'm sure everyone else does, is client growth is the easy one. Customer growth, absolutely. Customer client engagement, NPS is huge, and I don't just mean general customer NPS, product specific NPS. There's some real basic things that are around customer focus, NPS, your CSAT scores, etc. But for me, the really interesting one where there's much more of a focus, especially as investment starts slowing down, etc., it's return on investment, which is how much OPEX capital are you spending on each value stream, and where is the return actually coming from? It's really difficult in product to kind of have a quarterly return or a return within 6 months. Yes, there's stuff you can do about onboarding flows, etc., about getting more engagement. Typically, those are all great features that you can introduce. But to really see the significant return on the investment from a business case point of view, you typically need a 6 to 12 to 24-month window. So the key thing is, how do you measure the return that you get on the investment? Because when you go to your board or when you go to the investors about the incremental investment you want to make or the savings that you need to make in the business, it's really important to talk about the ROI on the investment that you're making, because anyone putting money into a business wants to see that the money is being used efficiently to get a higher return. And a lot more of our time as CPOs is actually spent working with the CFO, the CEO, and the board to figure out what is the right level of investment needed for the growth of the business and what is the right level of investment to ensure that the business is going to grow the way it needs to grow. And as CPO, you have to be having those conversations around investment and return. And it's not easy, but it's impossible to do it when you're doing it on a project-based period, where it's breaking it up into easiest to justify chunks around where the value is created. That typically drives a much easier, simpler conversation around how you justify the return you're getting in a particular area. Because if each value stream's got a set of OKRs or KPIs that you can measure against, it's much easier to have the conversation around, over the long term, this particular investment is driving these types of outcomes for the business. That's something that resonates with CFOs and boards.
Right. And so we're almost out of time, but I want to ask you one more question, and it's about product ops.
Yes.
What is your opinion on, the value of product ops?
Yeah, it's a great question. 5 years ago, I didn't really know what product ops was. I'd kind of run the teams, I'd try plan stuff, etc. But over the past 5 years, it's become such a critical function to the way I work, which is how teams do their planning, how teams document things, what tools teams use, how often teams do their planning, etc. All of the machinery or infrastructure around how product and dev teams run, for me, that is the role of products. We were mentioning earlier, the sales ops is about Salesforce tracking and measuring how effective the sales teams are. The only way you can get effective use of your product and dev teams is by having a really strong products function that actually drives the cadence within the organization and drives the consistency across the different teams in terms of how they track and measure things efficiently and effectively. Because if you don't have all your stories in a single tool like a Jira or whatever other tool that you're using, or Dragonboat type tool, if you don't have visibility into where your resources are being allocated consistently and over time, there's no way to actually drive those improvements. So products is all about a consistent way of measuring the effectiveness of the teams and driving that continual improvement. So yeah, Hugh, I can't say enough about the importance of products to a scaling and growing product function.
Right.
And it has to be a dedicated person or 2 or 3 people. Trying to do that on the side of someone's job is it's really difficult, and it's a very different skill set to product management.
Oh, completely. Well, thank you so much, Spiros. This was really illuminating session. And thank you to everyone who joined today. It's been such a great conversation. Don't forget to join us in the following weeks. We have some more speakers lined up all summer until the end of August.
Yes, and good morning, good night, everyone. Have a lovely day. It was a pleasure sharing my thoughts with you. And please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or any other mediums. Happy to share perspectives or opinions. And thanks for your time. And thank you for the invite. It's been a pleasure getting to know both of you.